Welcome back to The Truth About the Market. I'm Jason Zilberbrand, president of VREF, longtime aviation appraiser, and someone who has spent over 3 decades deep inside this industry. I've worked with everyone from celebrity owners to Fortune 50 flight departments. I've testified as an expert witness in federal litigation, and I've seen more market cycles than I can count. And in today's episode, we're going deep into transactions. It's the hidden world between your offer being accepted and title transferred. And we're going to break down the steps to closing, why everything that can go wrong usually does, and how to recognize when you're in a deal from hell. More importantly, I will give you the list of major red flags and tell you when you're in over your head. And I just want to say everybody loves talking about the airplane they bought, the one that came in under budget, closed in 2 weeks, perfect records, flawless pre-buy. It's like the guy that went fishing and, caught a 35-pound bass the first time he tossed in his lure. If you've been around long enough, that's a fairy tale. The real stories, the ones that teach you something, they come from the deals that almost killed you. Well, maybe not physically, but an awful deal will make you feel like you aged a decade. And this is the episode for anyone who's ever thought buying or selling an airplane was simple. If you're an aspiring broker, if you're a first-time buyer, or never been hands-on in the sales process, then this episode is for you. Spoiler alert, selling an aircraft is not easy. It requires a really savvy person, someone who has the innate ability to micromanage a substantial amount of red tape, as well as time, because if you don't take anything else away from today's episode, let this one sink in. Time kills deals. And keep in mind, the size of the aircraft really doesn't matter. All the steps I'm going to talk about are basically the same. The smaller the aircraft, the easier these steps may be, or they may happen quicker. But just because you're buying a $125,000 Cessna 172 should not give you the freedom to skip any of these steps. At least in theory, right? That's the golden rule. But right now, as I'm talking, someone is buying a plane without a pre-buy, and worse yet, they don't even see the plane until post-closing. This episode is brought to you by VREF, the trusted name in aircraft valuations and appraisals. Whether you fly a piston single or manage a business jet fleet, VREF keeps you grounded in data that matters. Visit vref.com to know what your aircraft is really worth before you buy, before you sell, and certainly before you finance. So let's start with how this should work, at least on paper. Step 1, right? You find an airplane, you agree on a price, and you sign a letter of intent. You prepare and sign an LOI or a letter of intent because it commits everyone to the deal, but more importantly, it's a roadmap. It's a roadmap for the purchase agreement. It spells out the terms. It spells out who pays for what do you get to do for a pre-buy. It spells out default. It spells out the closing terms, and it goes to escrow. If you skip this step, you're playing with fire. It's that simple, right? So once you have your LOI, it's been signed, it's been countersigned, it goes to escrow. Step 2, the buyer typically wires a deposit. It's usually 5 to 10%. It's usually refundable until you technically accept the aircraft. And then at that point, it goes hard, right? When we say goes hard, that means that your deposit is no longer refundable. And basically, you're going to walk away from that if you default at this point. If you technically accept the aircraft and don't close, that deposit will probably go to the seller. If you're using a bank to finance, this is absolutely a requirement before a commitment to funding occurs. You have got to put that deposit in place at escrow. And keep in mind, a lot of this stuff is happening simultaneously. So while I'm talking about step 1 and step 2 and step 3, sometimes step 2 and step 3 are occurring at the same time. So step 3 is a pre-buy inspection, and it should be scheduled at an approved facility, right? So approved facilities, this becomes a much bigger deal when you're dealing with larger aircraft. With a business jet, you want to go to an OEM approved facility or one of the big 3 independents. If you're with a smaller aircraft like a piston, a lot of people are going to rely on an A&P that's local to the airplane. That's okay. But keep in mind, this is why that LOI is so important, because what you want to do as a buyer must be agreed to in writing by the seller. It prevents lawsuits, it prevents disputes, and it allows the service facility or the A&P mechanic to complete the inspections based on what both parties, have said in writing, and with them both being on the same page. This is also the step that so many people make mistakes with. And I was once a first-time buyer as well as a first-time seller, and guess what? I got taken advantage of. So let's talk about why you're doing all of this. The inspection for the pre-buy is limited. It covers usually a logbook review. Oftentimes, if it's a piston aircraft, an annual will be signed off on. More often than not, it includes things like an engine borescope, a 5-point run. It'll probably include a soap test where they're looking to see if there's any foreign damage or metal in the filter, the oil filter. They'll look at known trouble areas, and they're going to make sure that all the components are within legal operating limits. But it also does so much more. It gives you serial numbers of the engine. It gives you serial numbers of the prop. If there's an APU, that as well. It'll allow you to discover corrosion before you own the aircraft. Corrosion is where things get ugly. They get ugly quick. And keep in mind if an aircraft is in for a pre-buy and something massive is found like corrosion, the seller or the owner of that aircraft is in a pretty big bind. They typically will have no choice but to fix it or work out a concession with you. But the lesson here is that you need to protect yourself. You got to know your exit strategy if things go south ahead of time and be willing to walk away from your deposit. Remember, your deposit, going hard after you technically accept the aircraft, if things go south, you got to be able to afford to lose it. So my advice is, always spend money on a good transactional attorney if you can't afford to lose your deposit. Going into this blind or by yourself can be very challenging. There's a lot of things that are going on. You have, the transactional side, which is typically things like inspections and logbook reviews and liens. But you also have the legalese side where you've got to be able to read a purchase agreement, letter of intent. You have to know what, your responsibilities are. So once you get through that, and again, a lot of this stuff is happening simultaneously, you're going to want to do step 4, which is title, liens, registration. You got to make sure all that stuff's verified. So if you're financing, this is probably going to be handled by the lender. If you're paying cash, it's all on you. You got to call your escrow company. You got to order a title. You got to order a lien report. You have to know if there's debt on the aircraft. If there's a lien on that plane and you close, or if there's a clouded title, you own it. The debt transfers, right? And if you're financing and the title is clouded, you'll have some more work to do, because I can promise you right now the bank's not going to close until that's cleared up. But again, these are things to protect you. Why do you want to buy an airplane that's got mechanics liens? It just doesn't make any sense. So the pre-buy concludes, the discrepancies are addressed. The acceptance is signed. All the money now goes into escrow, and you're ready to close. And I know it sounds easy, right? But not in this market, because that's transaction theory, right? What we just talked about in practice, especially, in good markets, right? A lot of what we just talked about, it goes very smooth. But in a soft market, everything changes. Buyers become more cautious. Sellers get defensive. Lenders get cold feet. Escrow winds up playing referee. And suddenly what should have taken 45 days to close, maybe 30 on the short end if you're lucky, is now taking 90. And of course, everybody's fighting over everything at this point. So when the market softens, psychology takes over, and it's rarely logical. Buyers tend to smell blood. They assume they have leverage, right? Every squawk becomes a negotiating point. Then sellers start to panic. Carrying costs are very real. You've got hangar, insurance, maintenance programs, reoccurring, everything, right? So, and they'll typically accept just about anything to sell the aircraft after a certain point. Brokers become referees. Everyone's trying to protect their deal. No one's trusting anyone. You probably have seen it a few times. The fangs come out. Every little issue becomes a mountain. And every night you go to bed knowing the morning will only bring more problems. then lenders hesitate. Appraisals typically get re-reviewed. Advance rates might get trimmed. All of a sudden, subject to inspection suddenly means subject to committee. Maybe it's due to interest rates changing. Maybe it's due to the borrower's credit rate dropping. Or more than likely, the bank has just moved on to another deal with the promise of a closing. In other words, when the market slows, time becomes a weapon. Buyers know it, sellers feel it, and everyone loses if they don't control it. This is why time kills deals. If a buyer doesn't close when the emotions run high, the remorse often sets in before the purchase. I've seen it a lot. I've seen a lot of buyers come and go, hot and cold over the years. The idea of owning an aircraft is far more appealing to many than actually pulling the trigger on one, right? And the data doesn't lie. In a strong market, average time to close is 30 to 60 days. In a soft market, it's going to jump to 90 plus. The longer a deal drags on, the worse it gets because time feeds uncertainty. Speaking of uncertainty, if you're tired of guessing about aircraft values, you got to try the new VREF Online. Real-time data, quarterly updates, we track over 900 models. From residual value forecasts to depreciation trends, it's the platform trusted by lenders, insurance companies, and every aviation professional worldwide. Subscribe today at vref.com and start making decisions based on facts, not feelings. So let me walk you through a deal that still gives me heartburn. Actually, it still gives me, it still makes me kind of nauseous if I have a nightmare about it. It definitely makes me nauseous because it was a deal from hell. But I think you're going to learn something. So it was a mid-sized jet. It was a clean airplane. It had been imported from another country into the United States. They had a $6.5 million asking price. We were able to negotiate it down to 5.9. By the way, this happened, 18 years ago, right? Many, many, many years ago. But it was such a nightmare that I remember it like it was yesterday. So on paper, this should have just been a routine slam dunk deal. Certainly one that closes rather quickly, but that was anything but the case. So Act 1, right? I call this the setup. The LOI gets signed, escrow's opened. My client, who's the buyer, he posted a $250,000 deposit. We scheduled the inspection in a major MRO. Everyone's happy. This was their first airplane. Then the first issue appears. Logbooks were a mess. Half were digital, half were handwritten, none of them aligned. There were 337 forms that looked like ransom notes, which should have taken a week, dragged on for 2.5, right? This logbook review went on forever. And this, of course, leads to questions. And with the seller unaware what the problems associated with the messy records, what are the brokers supposed to do? So 2 weeks in, the pre-buy starts. And I call this Act 2 because the pre-buy literally turned into a crime scene. So 2 weeks in, we find corrosion under the lav, a broken seat rail. On this particular aircraft, that was a pretty big deal because it was handmade and a whole seat rail had to come out, all the seats, everything. It was a real nightmare. We found out that there were ADs that had been complied with, and that was just the airframe. The engines, you're never going to guess this. This really did happen, folks. I swear to you it did. So the engines on this particular serial number, they didn't belong in the aircraft. And I'm going to see if I can explain this. So the aircraft had on its type certificate 2 different dash numbers that were approved. However, this aircraft, this specific serial number, had a different dash number. And it wasn't in the operating manual, and it wasn't on the type certificate. And to make matters worse, the OEM didn't know the engines were on the aircraft, much less that they still existed, because it turned out that they were early testbed engines. So now the finger pointing starts, right? Who allowed this to happen? How was the former owner operating the plane, right? See, the issue is you can't just put any engine on a plane. It needs to be approved. So this was just a cluster of issues. And you could smell the lawyers getting ready to pounce. And here I was, the buyer's broker, trying to figure out how this aircraft ever got imported, right? Who was the guy at the FAA that signed off on this mess? And how did it fly, right? So the term duck and cover applies as everyone starts to avoid me. I can't get calls from anybody. The buyer immediately sees an opportunity. And remember, this is my client. So he calls me and he says, plane's a mess. I don't know how we're going to fly it. Lower the offer, right? Which I do. And the seller flat out refused. And he says, well, we'll fix it or at least figure it out. And suddenly the pre-buy became like hostage negotiation. It was absolutely crazy. So we go to Act 3, and I call this the blame game. So escrow, after the typical back and forth and threats of default, the deposit becomes non-refundable. The buyer and the seller's lawyers start raising the proverbial bar. Escrow escalates this, right? And so they freeze the funds. This way, no party can control the default, not until at least escrow looks into it. And remember when I said you need an LOI and a purchase agreement and a pre-buy? Well, this is why. I mean, this is worst case scenario. We have a plane that we can't transfer. We have engines that aren't allowing it to be operated. My client is so far deep into this, he really has no choice but to close. So obviously my client and his attorney now are refusing to release that second deposit because of all these discrepancy issues. And so the MRO is not going to release these aircraft now because the engines, they need major modifications. We still have this type certificate issue. And because the gods have a sense of humor, the buyers think that they can somehow get the plane not only into service, but conforming to a 135 certificate and make Christmas vacation flights. Oh, by the way, did I mention this all happened over Thanksgiving? So days become weeks. The pre-buy drags and drags and drags. We're 90 days in. And this is how long it took to get a resolution in place, right? So first, the engine manufacturer needed to find engines. Then we had to do airframe modifications to the aircraft. Then we had to have that seat rail replaced. So by the time all that stuff was done, it was about 4 months. So after closing, my clients then decide to sue just because they can. And the deal that was supposed to take 30 days, it took 3.5 years of my life. And no, they didn't make Christmas flights. They wound up chartering. And no, the aircraft never, ever did meet 135 conformity. So what's the lesson here? Well, there's a bunch. For buyers, never weaponize time, right? Good deals die of neglect. And I think that that's important. Lesson 2, don't ever, ever skip a pre-buy. I don't care how good the deal is. You're just going to do yourself a disservice if you close and then find something afterwards that was relatively easy to discover during routine inspections. 3, read your escrow agreement. Read that fine print. Demand full transparency. Know the seller actually owns the aircraft before you even think about going to closing, right? And we've talked about back-to-backs and all this stuff, but this is the time to do it. Make escrow be escrow. Force them, not necessarily to police the transaction, but to make sure that everything is legitimate. And then this is the obvious one, but I can't tell you how many people fail to do this. You're going to use an LLC, right? Chances are everybody does. Whether that's right or wrong is subject for another podcast. But, have your entity set up. Have your financing in place. Have your insurance ready before you send a letter of intent. Why do you want to make an offer on anything that you can't get funded for? I mean, who goes shopping for a house without being able to get a mortgage? It just doesn't make any sense. You got to remember you're dealing with, people that are selling their aircraft and they don't want to be jerked around unknowingly. So do yourself a favor, get all of that stuff in line ahead of time. It's going to make the process go much quicker. And then the last one, and I think that this is really important. Don't chase a bargain that becomes a burden, right? We call it penny wise, pound foolish, whatever whatever you want to use, whatever phrase. The point is that a good deal is a good deal for a reason. The seller's passing the buck, right? You got to be careful. You got to protect yourself. So what are the lessons to be learned for sellers? Well, lesson 1, and if it's a piston airplane, you're probably going to laugh, but I can't tell you how many times this comes up. Organize your logbooks before the listing. Missing records, missing docs, logbooks that are disarray. Actually, an airplane that's dirty. It speaks volumes about you as an owner, right? Did you take care of the plane? If your logs aren't organized and I go to look at it and you've put it on the market for sale, shame on you. You want everything to go smoothly. You want the buyer to be impressed with how you've taken care of this aircraft and the logbooks are all a mess. So that's an easy one, right? Clean the plane, take good pictures, organize your logs. If there's something missing, disclose it early, right? That's number 2, disclose. Disclose everything. because problems always surface. And you don't want to beg forgiveness here, right? This is not the situation where you want to go to the buyer and say, oops. Just put it all out there. You'll do yourself a favor because there are buyers for everything. Regardless of how bad you may think it is, there's going to be a buyer out there that's going to work with you. Keep your maintenance programs current. I don't know what it is about engine programs today. We talked about it on the last podcast. I'm going to talk about it again on a future one, but I understand times are tight. Nobody wants to prepay for anything. But if you got your plane for sale, that is certainly not the time to let your engine program lapse. Step 4, or lesson number 4, confirm, your title is clean. It's really simple. You could order this stuff from escrow before you put the aircraft on the market. You can find out if there's a lien, right? And you're going to have to deal with it anyway, so you might as well do it before. That's just a horrible situation. Don't do it. Do a little homework ahead of time. It's like $200 for the file. And then lastly, don't let an ego sink the sale. It does take two to tango, right? A willing buyer, a willing seller. People aren't beating you up. They're beating up the aircraft. They're doing it for negotiations. They're not doing it because they don't like you as a person or they're trying to hurt your feelings. You got to kind of let it go. And if you're the type of person that just can't, you probably should hire a broker because they will represent your aircraft without that type of emotion. So, if you're arguing over a $5,000 bill on a $6 million jet, you've lost perspective, folks, right? And when you're in doubt, you got to ask for help before it's too late. So yeah, hire professionals who close deals, not just chase them. So let's talk about the bigger picture, because the real story isn't corrosion or escrow disputes. It is about ego. It's about impatience. It's about poor communication. This happens across general aviation. It happens across business aviation, from $90,000 Cessnas to $9 million Gulfstreams. The mistakes repeat themselves. Aircraft transactions aren't just financial, they're emotional. People fall in love with airplanes and forget they're buying pieces of machinery that in some cases were built decades ago, maintained by different owners, and they're full of history. If there's one thing I've learned after decades of watching deals implode, it's this. Airplanes don't kill deals. People do. So what's the solution? Preparation, transparency, and professionals who know what they're doing, whether it's an SR-22 or a Challenger 300, the principles don't change, right? You have to understand the process. You have to respect the timeline. And when it starts to go off the rails, you got to ask for help before it's too late, because the only thing worse than losing a deal is closing the wrong one. Look, if this conversation helped you see the market differently, do me a favor, share this episode and subscribe to The Truth About the Market. And remember, when you need accurate, defensible, and data-driven aircraft values, there's only one name in the industry to trust, and that's VREF. Visit VREF.com to get started today. Well, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I hope that you took away something. There's a lot of lessons to be learned. Remember, time kills deals. Until next time, I'm Jason Zilberbrand, and this is The Truth About the Market.